Welcome. Today I'm going to discuss a few glazing techniques with you. After listening to the video and seeing some examples of how to use glazes and different types of glazes, you should watch this video if you would like to learn some new techniques. A few of the techniques I'm going to show you today are the following. This is called a wiping away technique, which is a technique for getting glaze into fine lines and crevices. This is done on white clay, so it's going to have a slightly different look on red clay. Sponging, which is applying one glaze on top of another using a sponge to get a speckled effect. And then lastly, dripping. So here's a glaze that's been dripped and melted into the first layer. Again, this is done on our white clay body. Did have some labels on it. That's the black that you see. This is a piece of red pottery, the earthenware, and that has some nice sponging on it using the foliage green and some brown, as well as some various color layering on the outside. And they also did some wiping away in the flowers here. So the first technique I'm going to show you is called wiping away. Wiping away, again, is good for textures, fine lines, and it's a great way to get the paint to stick into an area of detail. So I have applied bluegrass, which actually looks much darker once it gets fired, turns a really rich green. So don't judge the glaze by what you see. So I applied a good heavy coat to this piece and I let it dry. It's not fully dry, but that's okay. When it turns chalky white, you know that it's pretty much dry. And then I'm taking my sponge in some clean water and I'm going to vigorously wipe the piece and continue to refresh the sponge until I see my texture coming through. And I can take off as little or as much as I want. From here, I could put on a translucent glaze, so a glaze that you can kind of see through. I could paint over it, or I could paint around it. Painting around it might be kind of taxing. So, a clear glaze or something that you can kind of see through would be ideal. So something that's translucent or semi-translucent. But again, painting around here would be an option as well. So I like how that looks. All right. Another technique is sponging. So here's a piece. When you sponge, I recommend that you put a first coat down of a color. So for instance, white. Blue would look great on top of white. Colors that are opposite each other, like orange and blue, those aren't going to melt together and look very good. They look great when they're side by side, like this red, orangey flower and the blue interior. But when layered on top of each other, they end up looking a little bit muddy. So here's a bowl that I've painted white. It's just a sample I had laying around. So I've already painted it with white glaze. And then I'm going to take a clean sponge. This one's not exactly clean, but I'll use the clean side of it. And I'm going to shake up my glaze really good. Okay. And find a clean piece of paper or a paper towel. And then I'm going to load up my sponge and get a bunch of the paint off until I start to see a nice kind of spongy texture. It looks like a strawberry. And then I'm going to take my pot and dab it with the sponge. Again, my sponge is a little wet. Works better if your sponge is dry. But you won't see all of these marks. The goal is that these colors kind of meld into the first color. You'll get a nice effect happening with when one color blends into the next. Okay. As you can see, this has a little bit more of a sponge texture to it because the sponge was drier. This one is a little wetter, so better with a little bit of a drier sponge. The last technique I want to show you is the dripping technique. You can see I've done that here. I am going to try to do it on this part of the rim to show you now. So what I've gotten here is my bluegrass glaze, and I watered it down just a little bit. I want it to be a little bit runny. I'm mixing it up because it does separate. You always need to mix your glazes good before you use them, but especially with the dripping. So I have added enough water that it's much more liquidy. And when I lift my brush up, you can see it's like dripping off. That's ideal for dripping. You don't want to thin it out too much though, because the materials that make up the glaze will no longer be effective. And then you can either use a small or large brush, depending on the size of the drip that you want. And I'm going to put that on the side of the piece. Depending on the lines and textures in your piece, sometimes the drips kind of have a mind of their own. If your piece is really straightforward, they'll probably behave. But if it's got a lot of protrusions or textures, you might find it kind of goes off in many different directions. So there's my drip. I worked straight down here, so it was a little bit more controlled. Here I was aiming it to the camera, so obviously it looks a little bit messier. So a cup or something that goes straight down is ideal for the drip, so this is a good shape to try the dripping on because it was going straight down. So those are 3 different techniques. You certainly can also just paint your glaze on. So again, this person painted white and then she layered with little dabs of red, little dabs of blue, a bit of green. So you may use any of these techniques or just go with good old-fashioned painting, which can also result in some really beautiful things. But I encourage you to layer where possible. The glazes will have more depth and beauty when they're layered. Thanks for watching.